Welcome to today's webinar, where again, with a great topic, Sean Devlin is going to be presenting. And we're going back to an original series, the best practices, which always get very high ratings. My name is Jan Eleman. I will be moderating today's session. So if you do have any questions, feel free to post them at any point in time in the questions channel, and we will make sure to answer all those questions before we end the webinar. As usual, the webinar is recorded and will be posted on our website. We were a little bit late with the previous recording about authentication and Okta. It is up on the website now, so if you want to watch it after this, then you can do that. With that out of our way, Sean, welcome.
Thank you, Jan. Yeah, as you can see, the past few webinars in this series, the topics here, and those are all recorded. So if you need to catch up, there's some good ones in there. Today we'll be talking about kind of how to do dialogues and different design patterns. And we got some good feedback about the best practices of series in this webinar series. We try to mix in best practices with updates because there's lots of product updates we have to manage and sort of integrations and things we see customers doing. But when we can, we try to mix in just some regular old how-to stuff, and those are generally quite popular. And so this one comes directly from a brand new Servoy user who had sent me a mail asking how to do some things, and I thought, yeah, we haven't done a webinar about that. So really, we listen to your feedback, and so keep it coming because that's where these come from. Today, we're going to talk about dialogues. As usual, we try to do demos first and then sort of do an overview of what you've seen. And I've organized a few demos here around different design patterns for dialogues, including modals and non-modals, multi-windowing, and simple user feedback dialogues. Also, I'll try to show a pop-up example, which is different from the modal and non-modal dialogues as well. So let's get right to it. I am going into the IDE and launching a solution. So here you see I have a list of customers, and what I want to have happen is when I double click on one of these customers, I want to show the detail in a dialog and edit it. So here we go. Oops, you know what? I was testing and I went to the last example. Let me comment that one out, comment this one in. Okay, that's the pop-up one. We'll get to that in a second. All right, rewind. So I'm going to double click this customer. You can see that I have a modal dialog. What this means is that I cannot interact with the screen below. I'm clicking around on the list and nothing's happening. Also, what this means is that any code execution after the dialog is shown is blocked and then resumed when the dialog is closed. So let's say I'm doing something like changing the sales rep to a different employee. You can see in the background that the data was broadcast into the screen below, but I can't interact with that. If I were to X out this dialog, I'm going to get another question dialog. If I want to continue editing or discard the changes, I'll click discard the changes. You can see that the sales rep was rolled back. We could do this again. This time I want to keep the changes. I'll click done down here. So a common design pattern is just using modal dialogues to sort of lock the user into a certain workflow, and you don't really let them out until they've completed the workflow one way or another. Now, dialogues are used in a non-modal design pattern too. So I'm going to come into the IDE and uncomment this and comment this and uncomment the non-modal approach and save it. You might notice that it's quite nice when you're working with Servoy. You can make code changes without having to recompile, redeploy, and even relaunch the client, and you can get right back into testing what you've just changed. So now what I'd like to do is show a non-modal dialog. So double clicking again on a customer, and you can see that this one is not blocking the screen below. And if I were to select a different customer, you can see that the record up here changes. So as I'm clicking around, I can interact with both windows. Now, I've seen a requirement for a different design pattern where we get into sort of multi-window or multi-instances. Let's say that my use case is that I want to look at 2 different orders at the same time, or maybe 5 different orders if I have a big monitor. So what I'm going to do here is comment this one out, and I have another method here called open instance. And now I will double click this. You can see that I have one order. I'm going to kind of slide it over here. I'm going to go to the first record and double click that. And now you can see that I've opened up the dialogs in two different windows, and I can do this until the cows come home if I really want to. But these are 2 different instances of the same form. I can edit them independently, so I could say change a record up here, save it, etc. Do it over here, save it, and close them. So in this case, when I double clicked, I get 2 different forms. Another way that we could show a form is to show it in a pop-up. Pop-up is different than a dialogue. That's because when I show this, it's an undecorated sort of window there, and I can interact with the screen below, but as soon as I click off of it, it's dismissed. So rather than having to physically close the window, it's dismissed. Typically, these are for quick little pick lists, like maybe you want to show a list with some checkbox options, and you show it and you check some things off and then you dismiss it just by clicking out. So the use case is a little bit different. Another use case for dialogues, and in sort of the modal example, I'm going to open up a record again, and we can do it right here in the pop-up, and I'm going to look for a customer. Pop-up doesn't really work. I meant to do this in the one of the other ones. Let's just do this one here. So I'm going to search for a customer here, and now I get another modal dialog. And the reason I want to show this is I want to show how you can handle the action after the dialog closes. So first we want to search for a customer. Let's say we're looking in the USA. Maybe we're looking for something in Portland. Okay, so we found the one we want, and we select it, and you can see that it writes it back in here. This is sort of like a customer picker, and it writes it there, and then I'm done. Okay, so we'll look at the code example for each of these. Let's start with the most simple one, which was opening the modal dialog. So I'm going to jump into the code here, and I did some work to just kind of select the data that was passed in, because we're gonna open it whatever record we passed in, but really just pay attention to these couple of lines here. It's pretty much 2 lines: application.create window. You give it a unique name. In this case, I'm sort of implicitly naming it the same as this form. You might even notice here that this is done in a base form. I don't want to get too into the topic of inheritance, but I can use this functionality anywhere, not just on the particular form that I'm showing. And then I'm picking a type, and the type is modal dialog. There's a couple of constants there. When I opened it in a non-modal dialog where I was able to interact with the screen below, I called this method here, and it looks almost identical except for the constant here is dialog instead of modal dialog. A key difference is that when I'm in the modal dialog, the next line of code wouldn't execute either in this method or in the calling methods. It totally blocks it. Let's take a look at the multi-instance or multi-window example. You remember that I showed the same order detail form twice. Well, I didn't have to design my order detail screen 2 times. I'm just reusing it. And so I'm using a different method here called create new form instance. Now, I didn't show you something important, which would be, say I'm doing the multi-instance example, and I have these two forms open, but let's say I go back to this record here and I try to double click it again. It doesn't open it again because it's already open, and that's important. We could, if we wanted to, open up multiple instances of the same record. So we make that distinction ourselves. So what I did here is I first create a unique name, and it's sort of the name of the form plus the primary key. So, order detail underscore, 100 or whatever the order number is. Once I have a unique name, then I create a new form instance and I give it the design form name and then the new instance name. So that name is important because it should be unique. Then what I do is I open the form and I just call the open method again, which goes to our open and non-modal dialogues. I'm reusing that method here. So really the only thing you have to pay attention to in the instance one is this create new form instance, and also just the check here to say, well, does it exist already or not? If it already exists, I'm just going to open it. I'm not going to create the new form instance or the new window. Okay, the other example we showed was the pop-up version, and this is just a one-liner to the window plugin. So plugins.window.show form pop-up, and really what you pass in is there's a lot of options there, but what you pass in is the name of the form or the form object itself. And so I'm passing in this, meaning, implicitly the form that we're working on. There's a mechanism for doing a callback and setting a data provider. That's a pretty strict use case, and that's where these other arguments come from, but it's really the second argument that matters in this case. We showed you another example where we did a modal dialog in the form of a pick list when I was selecting that customer. So I have a form called Picklist base, and in the code for that form, I had just a public method called open. And so that method was called, and again, it's just showing, creating the window and showing it. And remember that when we show a modal dialog, after we call this window.show, all of this code is blocked until the window closes. So what I'm doing is I'm sort of checking to see if the user picked something, and then I'm returning directly out of this method. So when I think I have a method called select customer. So when I called this, when I push the button, this method is called. It's encapsulated in a way that's really simple. I just call my customer pick list.open and it returns a record. I don't have to worry about when the code starts and when it stops and showing and hiding the window. I put that in the form itself. And this is a good design pattern when you want to have a form that you're showing in a dialog and it returns a value somehow. It's just encapsulate that all inside that form, and just, in this open method, it declares that it returns a record. And then if I pick something, I'm just going to assign that customer ID from it. Finally, I didn't want to get too into the topic of the dialogs plugin because that's for really simple dialogs, but if you're just getting started, it's pretty useful to know. You might have noticed that when I was closing the order detail dialog, I handled a form event called onHide. So I'm going to jump into that. You can see the event handler here. If I jump into that, I'm allowed to return a Boolean out of this to block it, so that if I try to X out the dialog without saving changes, I get a pop-up that says, what do you want to do? So what I do is I handle that onHide method, and I call this little inner method to see if what the user wants to do, and really just focus on this line right here, where I call plugins.dialogs show warning dialog, and it asks the user what to do, and if the input is that they want to discard changes, then we're returning true and we allow it to close. Keep in mind that in this on hide is called after the dialog closes, and here's where we revert edited records. So that's how the changes were canceled when I'm closing the dialog. So it's a bit of a sort of a disjointed workflow, but all the events are there for you to work with, and it's pretty easy. Let's go ahead and come back to some slides here to review this. So again, the first pattern we showed was the non-modal pattern. That's where the user can interact. The first pattern we showed was the modal pattern. That's where the user can interact with areas outside of the dialog, or cannot interact with areas outside the dialog, and the code execution is blocked until the dialog is closed. And that's really useful. There's nothing extra you have to program. You just show modal dialog, and the next line of code is executed when the dialog closes. A code example of this is really just the 2 lines of code where you create the window and make sure you use that constant, and then you show it, and then after that code is blocked. In the non-modal pattern, the user can interact outside of the window, and the dialogs do not block anything. So it allows you to sort of click around and have more than one window open, and the user can do what they want, and nothing's blocked. And again, it's the same. The code looks the same except for the constant that you use is dialog and not modal dialog. In the third example was a bit more complex because we opened up multiple dialogs at one time. From the windowing point of view, it's just calling that, create window again with the non-modal option. However, we use something called a form instance. And it's really important that the names are unique if you want to have those multiple windows. When we created those windows, we first created the form instance. So there's a couple of calls here. One is to create that new form instance, and the second is to create that window. In general, I use the same name for the form instance and the window because it's easy to keep track of. And you'll notice at the beginning, I sort of checked, hey, does the form already exist? Did we already create it and show it? Because I don't want to try to create the same form twice. If the user selected the record already, it's already there, so we might as well reuse it. But you just want to keep that name unique. Finally, on the really simple example, there are these one-liners to show if show some info to a user, and I did a show question dialog, which presents in a certain way and returns the button that they clicked on. This is really easy to use. It's always one line. It's always blocking, so nothing else executes, and it returns a value. There are other options here. Just real quickly in the IDE, I'll bring up my command console. And if you don't know about this, it's pretty handy. You open up the command console, and you can, with a running client, you can just execute code. And there are some other kinds of dialogues, like show select dialog. If I run this and I go right into the running example, you can see that the options that I passed in are there. And when I click OK, you can see that it was what it was returned. There's also the dialogs plugin. You even get code complete in the command console. Show input dialog. And again, you do the title, the message. Sorry for my loud keyboard. And then if you want, you can do an initial value. And that's it. And again, that's blocking. I did something. Oh, I think.
There's no quote behind title.
Yeah, okay, here.
Real-time code correction.
Yeah, exactly. Thank you, Jan. Well, we'll just put in whatever we want here. Option 1. Did I get all my quotes? Yes. So you can see now it shows the title, the message, and then the default value, but I could change this, make it option 2, and you can see that option 2 was returned by the dialog after it was unblocked. There's also a number of flavors. You can see I highlighted the dialogs plugin here. There's infos, errors, and warnings. They all work, and question, they all work the same. It's just the style on the dialog is a little bit different. All of them return the value of what was pushed on the button, and they allow you to pass in whatever you want for for those buttons. So most advanced users or medium users know about that, but if you're just getting started, you want to show something quick to the user, it's one-liner, it's pretty easy, it's good to know. Okay, I think that covers everything that we were showing.